very excited to talk to you guys, and hopefully you'll be able to take something from this presentation that you can use in your own live ops products, free-to-play live operations games that you are working on. So a little bit about me. My name's Scott Humphries. I've been around mobile games pretty much since they first appeared on the scene. I started at a company called Jamdat many, many years ago, which eventually got purchased by EA. So I worked at EA for a few years, and then after EA, I went to Disney. Right now, I work for a company called Amber. And Amber is an independent studio, and we're a game development and service-based agency. So people come to us, and they pay for us to create games for them or do video game services. And while I've been on the indie side for a couple of years, I worked on some big games with some big publishers. So my live ops experience extends beyond the Amber days, though I'm going to talk about the products that we've worked on at Amber here for you guys today because it's sort of a unique perspective in that when you're creating a live ops service for partners, you have to sort of think about it in different ways because the partner is looking for you to ideally optimize the game that you've took over. And for many years, Amber had sort of made a name for themselves by doing game development or technical operations or custom engineering type work. And in the past couple of years, we've sort of transitioned the team into becoming more of a live operations focused studio. So that means that we're also working on full development games while we're working on live ops takeover for other people's products. We've worked with a bunch of partners over the years. Some of these partners we've worked with in a live ops capacity. And the games I want to talk to you about today are two midcore games and two sort of casual games. And I could talk forever about these games and the learnings we've had on them, but I wanted to try to focus on a couple of areas for you guys that we could hone in on so you could get some learnings out of this instead of just hitting you with a bunch of different things. So we're going to talk about a game that we worked on for Disney called Inside Out Thought Bubbles, which is a bubble shooter puzzle game. I'm going to go through our theory on level balancing and game design on that game. So if you're working on a match 3, hopefully that would be helpful to you. We're going to talk about two games that we're working on right now for Gameloft that we've taken over for them. One is a game called City Mania, which is sort of like a SimCity-esque builder with more of a casual wrapper, and a game called Gods of Rome, which is a fighting game that takes place in the era of Roman gods, much like Contest of Champions, if you guys are familiar with that product. And then I'm going to also talk about a game that we developed originally called Rumble Heroes, because I'm sure a lot of you are creating live operations games that are not for other people, that are maybe for yourself. And I have some learnings in working on an original IP free-to-play game that I want to share with you there. So we're going to cover, hopefully, a lot of ground, but it's going to be pretty specific. And at the end, I'll make room for questions. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to hit me up at the end. All right, I talk really fast, so that's just a warning. Inside Out Thought Bubbles. So if you guys aren't familiar with this game, it's a bubble shooter. It's a linear progression-based matching game. So you go through the world of Inside Out by Pixar, and you traverse multiple levels, unlocking new characters. For Disney, we did a ton of stuff for this game. We're still working on this game for them. They had a team that was really talented that was working on this, and they wanted to move that team to work on a game called Emoji Blitz, which also became a success. But this game was still making money, so they just didn't want to let it die a horrible death. So we came in, were able to bring our team to bear in order to take over the game for them so they could move that other team strategically onto Emoji Blitz. So we've basically been able to keep this game alive for the last 2 years by doing live operations for Disney on it. And Overall, we've created over half of the levels that are in the game currently. So we have actually ended up working on this game longer than the original team that started it. One of the things that we look at when we're looking at game design and level design is that we want to create variability through the way that we design the levels. And you want to really look for sort of a roller coaster in level progression regarding difficulty. And the way that we track difficulty when we're working on a linear-based puzzle game like this is in average number of attempts of your user base. So if you have a level where the average number of attempts for people to beat it is 1, it's probably a tutorial level. It's pretty easy, and majority of people are going to get through it. If you have a level where the average number of attempts to complete it is 20, it's a very, very hard level because on average, it's taking people 20 times to play to actually beat that level. So when we initially set out to design a game like this that's a linear progression, we try to make sure that we're designing the difficulty to have these ups and downs so you're not having long periods of frustration where the game is too difficult or long periods of the game being too easy because then it's not going to be super engaging for the user. The way we do this is through a technique called rational game design. And rational game design has been around for a few years now, and it was, I think, made popular by some teams within Ubisoft. There's some excellent articles online you can read on Gama Sutra, and I've referenced them at the bottom of this slide if you want to check them out. But basically, what a rational game design says is that you can design a game using metrics and science instead of emotion and gut. And we embrace this, especially in free-to-play design, where a lot of the meta systems and a lot of the value that you're going to be bringing out in your free-to-play product is through spreadsheets, really. So when we're looking at designing a match 3 game like Inside Out, we start by creating a spreadsheet of all the levels that we're going to have, the mechanics that we're going to have at the top of the spreadsheet, things like frozen tiles if you need to break those tiles in order to make a match, or things like enemies on the board that may hinder your progress if you're trying to make a match. We put all those things at the top, and then we try to create maximum differentiation in our level progression. Because at the end of the day, you want the user to feel like they're having a new experience each level they play, either through challenge, either through the game events. And every few levels, you need to introduce a new mechanic because the ones that you're using start to get old. Now, the thing that's awesome about when you start creating these systems in a rational design way is you start creating the possibility for all these different levers to create emergent gameplay experiences. And what I mean by that is once you've created all these little mechanics you can start playing with in the spreadsheet, you can use those mechanics to create variability in levels as the game progresses. So where the first couple levels may have frozen tiles, at some point down the road, you're combining frozen tiles with enemies that move on the board, with tiles that you have to match behind existing tiles, with things that will block your tiles, and you can sort of combine all those things to create some really interesting mechanical differentiation in a game like Inside Out Thought Bubbles. So we design our levels, we release them into the marketplace with our assumptions of the average attempts that they're going to take. And then we look at some key stats when they come back through our metric systems on exactly what the user behavior is. We look at the difficulty, which is average attempts. We look at churn rate, which is people that leave your level and don't come back. And we look at average revenue per level, which is the amount of money that a user will spend in that level. Match 3s are all based around monetization of people spending for more turns or power-ups. So you know that you've got to balance your churn, the difficulty, and the ability for people to spend in your level effectively to have a successful Match 3 product. And then completion rate, right? So what percentage of people that are maybe failing your level are actually continuing to play and move on through the game. So in this example, I'm showing you we have a couple of flags in our level design as we've gotten the metrics back. Level 1074, level 1083, and level 1091 look off. Oh, that's the wrong way. There we go. So as we look at those levels, we start to make a couple of assumptions based on what we're actually seeing in the marketplace. So level 1074 has a pretty high churn. And it looks like the average number of attempts are pretty high over what our expectation was in the target difficulty. The game's making a pretty good average revenue per level, which is nice, but we have a stat where we basically divide the churn by the average revenue per level to get to a metric that shows how problematic that level happens to be. So in this situation, even though we're making some good money on that level, the churn rate is not worth it because we have a rating of 24. So basically we know we have to go in there and decrease the level difficulty until we get to the churn versus average revenue per level to a position that we're happy with. The second one you'll notice has a really low churn rate, which is great. We want people to keep playing. But the revenue that we're making on that level is really low. So in that situation, the churn versus average revenue per level is also high, but it's high for a different reason. So we obviously made that level way too easy. So now we need to go back, rebalance it, try to make it a little harder to bring up the average revenue per level, and we're okay taking a little hit in churn to bring up that average revenue per level. The final one, we had an assumption that target difficulty should be 10. Actual difficulty came in being harder than we wanted it to be, but when we looked at it, the levels of churn and average revenue per level are in a comfortable zone for us, so we're not going to touch it. And that's the other thing that you learn, is you may make an assumption that one level has to be a certain difficulty, but then when you actually get your data back from your user base, it actually turns out to be okay. So that's a really quick overview of how we balance our match 3 games. The interesting thing about this model, and because it's sort of scientific with the spreadsheet, is you can think about creating a system maybe through automation or through machine learning that can actually do that manually for you or automatically for you. So you can sort of decrease the amount of designers that are actually required in order to design a level and pump out more because you're able to basically create an algorithm tied to your spreadsheet on how difficult levels need to be and how those mechanics come together. Couple other things to keep in mind when you're working on level design, and this goes for non-match 3 games as well, I think. Any game that has a linear progression, which most free-to-play games on mobile do, you can probably use some of these tips. One of the things that's really interesting to look at is gameplay, because just from looking at the difficulty, you're not going to be able to understand something called success churn. Success churn is a term that basically means a user finishes your level and then they don't come back. It's a really hard metric to quantify from a game development standpoint, but when I found it to be an issue, success churn is usually because the game mechanic of that level is not meeting the user's expectations. And that could be because you've combined elements through your spreadsheet that just aren't fun. You've created too easy of a level, so users are getting through it really easily and they don't have a sense of challenge and they're leaving. Or you can have a sense of having too long of a period where the user is not being challenged and then they'll leave. So we sort of look for a 85% progression rate in all of our levels, regardless of the difficulty. And I think if you sort of stick to that 85% progression, you'll be in a pretty good state. But the big caveat here is every game is different. Where Inside Out Thought Bubbles has a certain difficulty, another game or another Match 3 game may require a completely different difficulty curve. We know Pixar is a license that is a family license, and there could be kids playing it. So when we're looking at our progression and our payer progression, we may have more of a casual audience than something like a Homescapes or a King Match 3, which might skew older in regards to demographic. So it's really important to understand your audience and balance the game appropriate for that audience to meet the metrics that you're going for. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about limited time events. And if you're working on a free-to-play game and you're not using limited time events, you're doing it wrong. Because limited time events are, in my opinion, one of the most vital things to have in a free-to-play game in order to drive success in many different KPIs: retention, monetization, and engagement. So I'm going to talk to you about limited time events in the two Gameloft games we're working on, because we've employed basically the same tactic in two games that are very different, and we've seen positive results in both. So for you guys that aren't familiar with this game, like I said, it's sort of like a SimCity type builder. You've got to build out a city. You have structures that you can unlock. You have these little guys called busies that kind of run around and will give you missions, but they'll also help you accelerate your buildings. This game we've actually been working on pretty recently, only for a few months, but we've still been able to drive some value in what we've been able to add to the product for Gameloft. So one of the things that we looked at when we were building limited time events for this product is what the users would be interested in. And when you're looking at limited time events for your game, there's something called an aspirational connection to source material or to your product. And that aspirational connection is basically what your user wants more of or wants to engage themselves in more of. And when we looked at City Mania, we saw that there were two areas that the user aspirationally want to connect to. One was upgrading their busies, which are the little people that run around your city. In order to upgrade your busies in this game, you need something called juice. We didn't invent the term. And the juice basically is used to level up your busies and make them more powerful. And that serves two purposes. One, the busies are just cool because they're running around your city. But it's also really valuable because once you level up your busies, then they can help you complete buildings faster, give you more quests, and there's a big sort of progression gate tied to busies. And the other thing we noticed is that users were really into the blueprints. So you can get blueprints in this game to unlock new buildings. And obviously, because it's a builder, the buildings are super important, and people want to make their city look bigger and better. So we knew that we had to create an event around blueprints as well. So when we were looking at creating events, we created what we called a seasonal event, which is generally like a quarterly event. It's a bigger planned event that we would bring this thing called the juice truck that would come by your cities, and you'd be able to interact with the juice truck to complete missions to get more juice for your busies. And then the other thing that we wanted to do was create smaller events tied to blueprints, where we would give like an exclusive blueprint for a limited time for a couple of days, and you had to complete some missions in order to get those blueprints. So for us, we designed the live events to basically follow a three-part process where we implement the live event, where we design it and then we implement it, and then we get the KPIs back and we analyze that progress, usually through A/B testing, and then we will make any changes necessary before we sort of launch that event live into the entire audience. The other thing that we spend a lot of time doing is scheduling our events and making sure that we have the right events within the right structure, maybe tied to the right seasonal holidays, if we're going to be tying events to holidays like Halloween, to ensure that we basically have our events planned out for 6 months ahead of time. And it's really important not just to plan your events, but when you come back into the game after you've run your event, to know and post-mortem how they worked so that all that learning can function into your future events. So when we decided to put these events into the Gameloft product, we decided to experiment. And the experiment was, well, let's not just tie them to the weekends. Let's see what happens when we tie them to the weekends and then add some in between the weekends that come like on every Wednesday. And the interesting thing was we first started running the events on the weekends, and we obviously saw a spike that you'll see on the left-hand side. But then when we started running the midweek events, we thought we might see some cannibalization of our end-of-week events because people are coming in and spending midweek. But we actually didn't. And it's really interesting because we're able to basically drive 30% more revenue a month by adding the midweek events, the little smaller events within the bigger events. So I wouldn't be afraid to experiment as you guys are looking at events. I would say, weekly events is a minimum. You want to try to bring people in every weekend because not only you're going to have more volume on the weekend because people are off work and hanging out, but because they're typically able to have also more time to play and spend. So weekends are key, and you'll see a lot of these games, like if you go on App Annie and you look at the grossing charts, they're always spiking on the weekends because they're running events on the weekends. But I'm here to tell you, you can actually run more than that. You can run them midweek as well, and you'll be able to see spikes. So in Gods of Rome, which is a completely different game, it's tied to collecting these Roman gods and these different characters that you'll use to upgrade and fight each other to basically progress through not only a single-player campaign, but also eventually get into PvP arenas. We tried to implement the same thing. And again, through implementation, analyzing, and optimizing, we were able to come up with some proposals for live events for this game. And the live events for this game were mostly tied around unique characters that we would unlock. So we brought new characters in every month. We started playing around with just changing the colors and sort of the art palette on a couple of the characters to make them uber VIP and uber rare, and that actually worked really well because it allowed us to get into an operational structure of releasing more characters faster without having to create a whole new character from the ground up. And it turned out that because their stats were there, functionally, this character might look very similar to another character. They were functionally actually more powerful, so people invested in having the gold armored character versus the normal armored character. So again, with this, we tried the same thing. We started with weekend events, but then we started doing midweek events. And we saw the exact same pattern that we saw in the other game, which was no cannibalization. In fact, people were spending and were happy to come in and spend midweek and during the weekends. So I guess the reason I'm telling you this is because when I say live events are key to any live operated product, you can figure out ways to make this work for any game you're working on, I think, and I'm pretty sure you'll see a success in trying this. The other thing that's interesting about this game that I always love to talk about is the team was really smart because even though the game was called Gods of Rome, we started seeing and looking at the metrics that from a territory perspective, we had a huge audience in China. And this is something that GameLoft never noticed, or at least they noticed it and didn't do anything about it. But my team was like, okay, we got to do something about this. Like, we have a massive user base in China. How do we address what those audience want? And Julian, in his keynote, mentioned something that I think is key, and I'm just going to reiterate it here, which is you have to know your audience, and you have to give your audience what they want, because at the end of the day, if you can figure that out and you can deliver to them, that's the true promise of live operations, right? That's a true promise of games as a service. So I'm really proud of the team because even though our game was called Gods of Rome, they're like, what if we added a Chinese deity to this game? And on the surface, it didn't make a lot of sense, but we're like, hey, the gods are gods, right? Let's bring a Chinese god into this and see what happens. So we brought in this foxtail god, Kumiho, which is a deity from Chinese mythology. And we were able to generate over 20% more revenue with this hero and this character than we were with any other that we released. The other thing that was really great about this character when we brought it to the market was that we saw that 51% of the payers during this promotion were first-time payers. So that means that basically half of the people that were spending on this character to get this character had never spent before. And it's really valuable to convert people into spenders, because once you convert people into spenders, they've basically become more attached to your product because they've spent money on it, so they're going to be more engaged. They're probably going to be spending money again. So this was a really great accomplishment of the team. By thinking outside the box a little bit, we were able to drive a lot of value by addressing our audience. And then the other thing that isn't often referenced, but I I think it's important to know is that limited time events aren't just for monetization, they create engagement. And if you can figure out a way to drive engagement with your limited time events outside of just people spending, they can drive even further value. So for instance, we were able to add some other features that accompanied those major events or those character releases that drove engagement value. So daily activities are super important. Not many people think of them as events, but if you can figure out a reason that's valuable to bring your user back every day, it's super valuable because they're obviously going to be coming back and experiencing your product. So we were able to add some daily events that were tied to these larger events and reasons for users to come back. The other thing that we did, which wasn't in there before, was since we started using the characters and the heroes as a big part of our live event structure, we knew we had to sort of have some menu where users could come in, see the heroes they had, and also see the heroes that they didn't have or the heroes that were coming soon. So believe it or not, this feature wasn't in the game. Like, you really had no area where you could go and see all your heroes in one place. So as we started releasing more heroes, we realized that it was really valuable to have this, and this drove a lot of value for us. And then obviously, because our game is an RPG and you're leveling up your characters and you're earning XP, doing things like releasing XP events where you can get double XP during this period when you're trying to grind to get a hero was really valuable in a complementary kind of way. So we saw people investing in the double XP event while they were trying to get a hero because it was going to basically help them accelerate through the hero acquisition. And overall, we were able to see a pretty impressive increase in engagement per session when we were able to add these events. So from a KPI evolution, from the point that we took over the game to the point where we are now, we were able to drive some pretty great value for our partner. And a lot of times, this stuff I wouldn't say is super hard. We're able to use it in multiple products if you can figure out a way to execute it. But the fresh eyes that we were able to bring to the table, learning from one product and bringing those learnings into another, enabled us to drive optimizations in both. All right, so you're saying, Scott, that's great, but like we're not all taking over games for other people. Like, what about we're working on our own free-to-play game? So we just released a free-to-play game that we worked on, original IP product. We released it with a publisher by the name of Rogue, with the assistance of an incubator by the name of Carbon. But this game was created internally by us. And one of the things that I think people miss a lot is the fact that in free-to-play and in live operations, you can start getting data about your game before you soft launch. And I think a lot of people miss that, and it's a big problem because sometimes when you've worked months on a game, you've optimized it from like a graphical standpoint, an engine standpoint, you get into the marketplace and soft launch, it's too late to fix some of the things that you could have learned before you released into soft launch. So I think there's an approach that we take that I wanted to share with you guys, and hopefully it could be valuable to you as you're thinking about working on your own original IP free-to-play games and moving them into live ops. So Rumble Heroes, if there's people, I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't know this game, but it's basically, think of it like Clash Royale meets Street Fighter. So we wanted to bring something new to the marketplace, something that felt a little fresh, but something that was sort of scratching that real-time PvP itch because we're all really big fans of Clash Royale. So we set out sort of thinking about how we can create this game that would combine the essence of the 80s and Street Fighter with real-time PvP. At Amber, we have something called the Game Development Framework. And when we're trying to figure a lot of this stuff out, we're typically doing it in what we call sort of the pre-flight process before we start any sort of formal production. And in that process, it's really important to get as much data and learning as possible because once you sort of enter formal production, which is the yellow part of our GDF, that's when you're spending the majority of your cash. And in order to sort of be cost effective, you want to make sure that you can, before you move into that production period, you're pretty confident that what you're going to start building will work in the marketplace. So here's some tactics that we use to do that on this product specifically. The first thing that we do is, we go into our App Annie account, or there's a bunch of other websites that you can go to kind of get data on other people's games, and look at competitive products. And we look at the competitive products for the game that we're trying to build. So, in this situation, we were looking at a couple of different competitive products. We were looking at like Street Fighter, what people liked about it, how much money it had made as a franchise, was that style interesting for people? We were looking obviously at Clash Royale, and we were looking at a game called Line Rangers, which not a lot of people may know about, but it's also sort of a real-time PvP type product that did really well in Asia, but didn't do super well in the United States. At that point, we create a profit and loss business case, basically tied to what we're seeing those games doing from a revenue standpoint, what we think their KPIs are based on our research, to put together some sort of idea of how much money we think this game could make with the right type of audience. When we're looking at games in the marketplace, we sort of start in this top-down viewpoint, because you could have a really cool mechanic, you could have the most innovative game ever, but if you're not really hitting those things that is going to make the market interested in it, it's going to be really hard to make that product successful. So we're sort of looking at it market first. And we look at it market first, we know that our game has to be familiar, but it also has to have a bit of innovation to stand out. It can't be 100% innovation, because then it's going to sort of not exist in the consciousness of our users. They're not going to know what the game is when they go onto the App Store and download it. They have to somewhat know what it is, but then we got to bring something new and interesting into it that makes them want to download it over our competitors. And then we sort of put together our P&L, our profit and loss scenario, to come up with some sort of estimation on how much we think this can make. And if we think there's a business case there, then we move into the next stage, which is market testing your concept. And this is something that a lot of people miss, but it can give you a lot of learnings. Because basically what you're doing is you're creating a fake game and putting it into the marketplace to try and see what people think of it. The first place that we go is we look at our competitors' products, games that may be very similar to the type of game that we're trying to make. We'll look at, for instance, their Facebook creative, and then we'll create our own fake creative and put that on Facebook. We'll throw a little bit of UA money into that to get some people in, and then when they click on install, instead of installing the game, they'll get like a survey or something that will hopefully give us some more learning about what type of audience they are, what they're interested in. This is really cool because you can basically get the stats that you normally get when you're click to install a game using user acquisition. So this can give you a lot of early learnings about things like conversion, about things like click-through, that you're going to need to know when you actually start paying for marketing on your product. The other thing that's really cool about this is you can start testing out different themes. If, for instance, the Street Fighter theme didn't resonate, maybe we try something else, right? Maybe we go with something more like a sci-fi shooter theme for our design, or maybe we go for ancient Rome theme for our design. But basically, this allows you to get to a point where if you have an interesting mechanic, you can start to think about how to make it more marketable, so when you get to the point that you actually need to start making money on this and driving acquisition, it's something that will resonate with the audience. One thing I forgot to mention is actually, if you can't do this yourself, there's a company called Store Maven that could do it for you. So you basically send them the assets, like you send them fake screenshots, fake icons, and they'll put together this campaign for you, and they'll run the test. So then you get your data back. Just like you ran a UA campaign, you'll be able to analyze the data, determine if the product is resonating, if the creative is resonating. Obviously, you want to try a couple of different things. So we tried a bunch of different creative, and then we compared all the different creative to see which was driving the best click-through rate. And then you sort of pick that thing, and you figure out what's resonating about it. The other thing that's interesting is you may test a demographic on Facebook, because you can sort of signal the social graph of the people that you want to hit with that marketing. You may find that the audience you think you have is not the audience that you do have. And that's a really interesting discovery too, because for us, one of the things that we discovered was that because our theme was a little more, looked a little more like Street Fighter and looked a little more like arcadey, our game was skewing a lot more with casual than more the mid-core type audience that Clash Royale was getting. So then we automatically knew, okay, well, let's try to focus more on that demographic because they're giving us the lower CTR, and we're going to be able to probably stand out in the marketplace without having to compete with teams like Supercell by going after that type of audience. And then sort of once you get that idea of, is my game marketable? Are people interested in it? Is there probably an opportunity to drive some meaningful user acquisition on this title? Then you can start building it. Create a pretty rough prototype. We started with the super rough prototype in 2017. You see it right there. It kind of doesn't, I mean, it looks similar to the end game, but it was really just like a lot of found assets together just to get the gameplay across and the theme that we were trying to hit. And we took it to GDC, and we just like gave it to a bunch of people, and we had them play it, and we got their feedback and their honest feedback, and we just took notes, and we must have hit like 200 people at GDC just playing our game. The next time we showed it was at Gamescom, and we had a little booth at Gamescom, and we had people come by and played it, and we took notes, and we watched them play it. Then we did an online playtest, so once we kind of took learning from there, we used this thing called Playtest Cloud. And Playtest Cloud is awesome because you basically send them an APK or you send them an IPA, and then they have this interesting tool that can allow people to play it on their phone, and you can hear them and you can see their button presses, and it's all on the internet. So basically you send them the build, and then like in 48 hours, they send you back a bunch of videos of people playing your game and commenting on it live. It's really a cool service, and I can't recommend it enough if you're trying to learn about your game from a user standpoint. And it's not that expensive. It's like $50 a user, I think. And you don't need that many to start learning about your game. Like 5 people playing your game will generally start to come up with the stuff that's problematic in your first-time user experience, or if it's too hard, or if the art sucks. And that's the sort of feedback that you want to start to understand how you can pivot the game to make it better. And the other thing is, before you even go into soft launch, do a closed beta. There's a lot of ways now through Test Flight or through Hockey App, if you use Hockey App, to get builds to people without going on the App Store. We gave out cards at, I think, a Casual Connect with a QR code on it, and we got like 500 people that downloaded our game and were playing it for free. So, you know, it's really important that you can sort of put together these levers. So before you enter soft launch, you've got a good understanding of what you're looking at from a gameplay standpoint and from a metric standpoint. As much as possible, get to the quant metrics. The qualitative metrics like, oh, I don't like it, you're going to get that stuff when people play it. But the faster you can get to the quant metrics, like the online play testing and the closed beta stuff, is going to help you for soft launch. And then, you know, you can employ the same sort of general triad of ideas here once you enter soft launch. So implement, analyze, and optimize. I would say, you know, once you've gotten your data back and everything looks good the way you want it, you've got your creative established, you know where you're going to run UA, you pick a territory that you think is going to match your target demographic for the game that you're creating, and then you have your analytics tool set set up, so when you actually release the thing in user acquisition and in that soft launch territory, you're getting key data back and you're able to analyze that data. You probably need a budget, depending on where you launch, somewhere around $1,500 to $2,500 to do some soft launch UA, because you know a lot of people go into soft launch and they're like, yes, we're in soft launch, to start looking at the KPIs, and there's like 5 people downloading the game, and there's like no statistically relevant data there. So you're going to have to spend some money on getting people into your game, so you're going to have to budget that for whatever territory you decide to soft launch in. I think 2,000 users is fine. I think if you can get 2,000 users, you can sort of aggregate them together to look at retention stats, which in my opinion is the most important that you want to start looking at in soft launch. You get to monetization later, but if your retention is good, then you can sort of, I think, solve the monetization issues. And in my opinion, the very most important thing to look at in retention when you first soft launch is first-time user experience, or FTUE, because You basically want to be able to add game events from when the person first clicks on your game to the point where they exit. Your first-time user experience, usually like a tutorial, or usually the point where you let them off the rails to play the game proper. And that's where you'll start to recognize probably a lot of your pain points at first. So setting up game events for every time a user does input during that first-time user experience and tracking that once you soft launch is super important. And then, like I said, finally, engagement and retention is the most important out of the gate, and then monetization comes later.
Localization.
So for localization, we don't usually tackle that until probably sometime later in soft launch, because usually the territories that we launch in are English-speaking first for us, the type of games that we're creating. However, one time I remember at Disney was really interesting. I can't remember off the top of my head the game it was, but we did Canada for soft launch back when people were still doing Canada for soft launch. And we saw something really interesting because we actually, during the soft launch period, we were doing localization because we had good KPIs. So like I think one of our mid-soft launch builds, like 3 months in or something, had French in it. And we all of a sudden saw our KPIs in Canada go way up. And we're like, that's crazy. Why did our KPIs in Canada go way up? We didn't change anything. And then we realized that when we added French, it just drove the value a lot for the French-Canadian speaking people there, and it was really interesting. So I'm not saying don't do it. You can find value there if you know your audience, and you can implement it at the right time.
Well, I was curious because you said that that game that had a Chinese appeal, was that localized at all, or was that English content that organically drew the Chinese players?
That game was localized. By the time we got it, it had been out for a year with Gameloft. So when it came to us, it was already fully localized, and yeah, it was in Chinese.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi. Initially, you talked about level design, and you're talking about troughs and peaks, where you have like difficulty does not steady, but it is like increasing and decreasing. So I'm wondering, I mean, at some point you'd have something that's progressing to increasing difficulty, even though there are like troughs and peaks. So what would happen if you have like thousands and thousands of levels? So at some point it would become increasingly difficult, right?
Yeah, so a lot of people think when you're making a puzzle game that you just keep on increasing the difficulty and increasing difficulty, right? That's the wrong approach. Somewhere around, depending on your game, level 75-ish, you've got probably 7 days of investment. At that point, you don't want to keep increasing the difficulty of your game because you're going to start to alienate your audience. It gets too hard. So what I've seen work in puzzle games is you get to a point where you sort of hit that sweet spot, and then you just kind of keep the roller coaster going at a steady state. Games, companies like the guys that do, what's it called? I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's the match 3 where you kind of go around the world and you tour around. They add like 300 levels per update because they're doing a bunch of programmatic stuff. If you ever play their game, Gummy Drop, that's it. They're not really getting harder. They're just kind of varying that like sweet spot difficulty, and like you're coming back and you're engaging in a comfortable difficulty level, and they just keep you going, right? Because remember, it's not necessarily that you want the game to get more challenging, it's that you want the users to stick around. And if you can figure out a way to get the users to stick around at that sweet spot, that's exactly where you want to hang out pretty much forever.
Thank you.
Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi. I was thinking about what kind of business models do you see evolving in live ops as a service, as an industry?
I'm sorry, what type of business models do I see what in live ops?
So in live ops, like when you're providing it as a service, what are the business models do you foresee in future? Right? How do you charge right now, and like how do you think?
What is our business model? Like how do we make money?
Yeah, right now, and what do you see in the future? Like, is there any variations in that?
Yes. It's funny you mentioned that. I was actually talking to someone over here that was telling me their business model for live ops, because they do the same thing we do, but it's very different than what we do. So what we do is we will go in for a partner, and my team is based in Bucharest. So we have usually a cost difference for people that have studios in North America. So we'll come in and we'll be able to lower the operational cost of the team that they have internally, first of all. But then we say that we also be able to drive value there from an optimization standpoint. So the first thing we say is like we at least need to handle our burn from a cost standpoint, and we don't take any upside unless we can generate higher KPIs and higher value for you, and then we will take some of that upside. So that's our model. We automatically come in and can lower costs for them because we're cheaper than their current team. Automatically start making more profit. But then we'll drive value for them, and we won't take any of that until we actually go above a baseline that we create with them. Some other people are doing pure rev share. Some other people are coming in and saying, look, we'll support the development ourselves, and we're just going to make rev share. And those teams, I'd imagine, are taking a bigger rev share than we are because we're taking less risk because we're getting paid to do it. So I'm sure they're taking more of a rev share because they're taking more risk. And then another model people are doing that I've seen is some people are just straight up buying the games. Some people are coming in with some capital and saying, tracking the game kind of like I was doing in the beginning before we started design on Rumble Heroes, but with a game in the marketplace, and figuring out that there are things they can do to drive value, and will buy the game outright to take 100% of the rev share or the majority of the rev share. So I think those are the three major models that I'm seeing with people kind of doing this, but there's not a lot of people yet that are engaging in this type of live ops as a service model. I think there's maybe a handful of teams that I've met that are actually doing this.
So with game difficulty, you're talking about average attempts per level. So different people have different skill levels. So would you recommend having like a personalized difficulty for like different buckets of users? What is your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, so yes, it's really hard to track though. The moment you start branching your linear progression, it becomes really challenging to track the things that you want to track, like average revenue per level and average attempts, because at that point you've sort of opened the web, and now you've got a bunch of different tracks of people playing at different difficulties. It's possible to do it. It just makes it more complex. What we like to do is we like to sort of have a fail state system. So like if for some reason someone is like coming out at the bottom of the difficulty curve, like for some reason it's way too hard for them, and even though the average difficulty is like 5, for some reason they keep coming out at like 15. We like to kind of put in a little escape hatch there. So like our engine could know, for instance, they failed more times than the average, or some pain point more than we're comfortable with them because they'll get frustrated, and then we just kind of make it easier for them so they can pass. Those are usually not the norm, but that's something that you could do. The other thing that you can do is create more of a sort of machine learning type system that can evaluate it in real time. Those systems are really complex, but I think there's some teams that are using some of that for progression-based puzzle games.
Thank you so much, Scott, and a big round of applause to Scott.
Thank you.